French Revolution is broken up into 4 different stages, and this video will discuss the first stage of the revolution. Before the revolution started, France was controlled by the King of France, Louis XIV, and his wife, Marie Antoinette. France was considered to have an absolute monarchy where the king had complete control. And King Louis XIV had been in control since 1775. Louis and his wife lived very extravagant lives in the Palace of Versailles, which is located between 10 to 12 miles outside of the city of Paris. Their extravagant lifestyles are part of the reason that lead to the French Revolution. France is going to have many problems within the late 1700s. The country was in a lot of debt because of the French and Indian War in North America, in which they had taken part in, and France had also helped the United States during the American Revolution, which put them into more debt. And King Louis XIV was unable to collect taxes to pay off his debts. At the time, he was trying to collect taxes from the more wealthy individuals within France, and they refused to pay these taxes. And so what Louis is going to do is he is going to call a meeting of the Estates General, which is a legislative body of that's made up of individuals within France from the different social classes. And this is going to be the first time that the Estates General is going to meet within over 100 years because kings had had complete control of France during all of this time. So to understand exactly what the Estates General are, it's a group of individuals that's broken up by social classes. There were 3 different estates within France. The very top was the first estate, and this was the clergy. These were members of the church, and it was approximately 0.5% of the population of France, and they were not taxed. The second estate was the nobles, and these individuals were also not taxed. They were about 1.5% of the population. So the clergy and the nobles were considered very wealthy at the time. Both were not taxed. The third estate is basically everyone else. It's 98% of the population. This included the bourgeoisie, which was 10% of the third estate. These were like the middle class people. And then 90% of the third estate were peasants and city workers. The third estate is the only one that is taxed, and they are the least wealthy out of all of the estates, but they're the ones that are taxed. So it didn't really make any sense that the top 2 estates, which had more money, were not being taxed at all during this time. And King Louis XIV was unable to get them to pay their taxes. So that's one of the reasons why he calls a meeting of the Estates General. He's hoping that by meeting that they can make a decision on what to do about France's debts and help bring the country out of debt. And also, King Louis XIV was hoping that the top 2 estates would hopefully realize that they needed to start paying taxes. So Louis XIV is going to call a meeting of the 3 estates in the spring of 1789. And each estate is going to hold an election to pick the representatives to go to the Estates General meeting. And each of the members that are elected were told to write up a list of grievances that they wanted to talk about during the meeting. One of the major problems is, though, France voted by estate and not by population. So each estate is going to have 1 vote, instead of every individual having 1 vote. And the third estate wanted to vote by every person, which would give them more power because they're the majority of the population, and they had more members there. Every time that the estates would vote, they were afraid that the clergy and the nobles would outnumber them because they would have 2 votes and nothing would get passed that would benefit the Third Estate. So the Estates General is going to meet in June 1789, and the Third Estate is going to be very angry with the king because he is not supporting them and supporting their idea as well of having every individual vote within the Estates General. So what they're going to do is they're going to start their own meeting, and they decided to declare themselves the National Assembly. And when they do go to meet with each other on June 20th, 1789, they're going to find out that Louis XIV has locked them out of the meeting room. And so what they are going to do is they're going to move to a nearby tennis court. All this is taking place at the King's Palace in Versailles. And it was a huge compound with tons of buildings and rooms and housing. So it's almost like its own little city. So they moved to a nearby tennis court. And it's here that these members of the Third Estate, as well as some sympathizers from the First and Second Estate, they're going to take what's known as the tennis court oath. And they're going to agree to meet together until they drafted a constitution for France. So they wanted to remake the government of France. While this is all going on, there are going to be rumors that are spreading throughout France that the king's troops were starting to mobilize and that they were going to march to the city of Paris. And so crowds of Parisians are going to make sure that they are armed with weapons in case this does happen. So on July 14th, 1789, several Parisians are going to march to what's known as the Bastille. And this was a fortress. And at the time, it was being used as a prison. They were convinced that there were weapons inside the Bastille, and they wanted to confiscate them. So when they arrive at the Bastille, they are going to demand that the weapons be given to them. And the governor of the Bastille, the prison, he's going to order the troops that are there to fire at the crowd. And 88 people are going to be killed. The crowd is only going to get more angry, and they're going to take revenge by capturing the Bastille and killing the governor. And they're going to let free the few prisoners that are in there. When they do take control of the Bastille, they find out there are no weapons there. The storming of the Bastille, though, is really considered a patriotic day for people in France still. It's still celebrated. I could compare it probably to the 4th of July in the United States. So it's a very patriotic day for the French still today. After the storming of the Bastille, peasants in the countryside of France, they're also going to start to get worried. They fear that the king and nobility are going to attack them. They had heard rumors that the king's army was on their way to the countryside to attack peasants. And so scared peasants are going to form their own militias, and they're going to start to attack and burn down manor houses throughout the countryside. And today historians call this the Great Fear that took place. So different groups of people throughout France are starting to take a stand against the nobility and the king, and they're trying to make change. In response to the Great Fear, the National Assembly is going to have an all-night session. And this is going to happen on August 4th, 1789. And they're going to abolish all forms of privilege in this all-night session. They're going to get rid of the church tithe, which was a tax that peasants had to pay. They're going to get rid of nobility's hunting privileges. and feudalism is going to be abolished. So there'll no longer be peasants serving as serfs and being forced to live on land. The whole concept of knights and nobles is going to be abolished by the National Assembly during this all-night session. They're also going to abolish the sale of offices. So at the time, if you wanted a high office within the government, you could purchase it. So they abolished this as well. Also in the month of August, the National Assembly is going to write the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It's very similar to the Declaration of Independence in the United States. They use the Declaration of Independence as an example to help them write this. So this document is going to proclaim liberty, security, property, and resistance to oppression to be all natural rights, along with freedom of speech, religious toleration, and liberty of the press. And all citizens are going to be seen as equal before the law, and none could be imprisoned or punished without due process. Keep in mind, this is really just for man, not for woman, but it is a start of change within the country, which had been controlled by an absolute monarch for so long. Things are going to get worse within France. The price of goods is going to continue to skyrocket, especially the price of bread. And it's going to be very expensive to be able to buy food, especially within Paris. So the women who are very upset with this, they're going to take part in what is called the October Days. And this happens in October in 1789. And it's really brought on by the rising price of bread. So the women of Paris, they're angry about the rising price of bread. They're angry about rumors that King Louis XIV was not cooperating with the National Assembly. So the women of Paris are going to march to Versailles on October 5th, and they're going to demand to speak with the king. This group of women, they're going to break into the palace, and they're going to call on the king to return to Paris. The following day, the king, with all the women and the National Guard with him, are going to go back to Paris where he will stay. The women of Paris felt that the royal family needed to see what was happening in Paris and see the turmoil that everyone was going through, because they were in their seclusion of their palace, which was not allowing them to see how everything was impacting French citizens. The National Assembly is going to continue to meet. In November 1789, the National Assembly decides to confiscate all church lands, and they're going to use them as collateral for issuing paper money. They're hoping by issuing paper money, they can help to stop inflation. The following year, they are also going to pass the Civil Constitution of Clergy, and this is going to bring the church under the control of the government. So bishops and priests are going to have to swear an oath of allegiance to the government, and the goal was to make the church free from interference from Rome. They wanted to make the church a national institution controlled by the government. And many members of the clergy were very against the Civil Constitution of Clergy. While this is all happening, the king, who is being urged by his wife, Marie Antoinette, is going to try to flee the country. In June 1791, he is going to be urged by his wife to have the family flee. Marie Antoinette had been in contact with her brother, who was Leopold of the Second of Austria, and she was hoping to start a counter-revolution with foreign support, especially from her brother. And what's going to happen is the family is going to disguise themselves and try to flee France. The king, however, is going to be the one that is recognized, and they're going to be caught before they reach the border, and they're going to be brought back to Paris. In September 1791, the National Assembly is going to finally finish their constitution, and the constitution is going to create a constitutional monarchy within France with a legislative assembly. So they would still have a monarch, Louis XIV. He wouldn't have total, absolute control like he had before. There would be an elective legislative assembly that would make the day-to-day decisions for the country of France. So this was the change that the National Assembly made. So what's going to happen is towards the end of 1791, the countries of Austria and Prussia are going to declare that the rights of King Louis XIV were of common interest to all sovereign nations within Europe. And so they were considering going to war with France. They wanted to preserve the monarchy in France, the other nations. And the National Assembly is going to decide to declare war on both of these countries. The National Assembly thought that a war could really bring together the nation and bring together other individuals who hadn't really jumped on board with this revolution and change. And they thought it could really create nationalism throughout the country. So the Assembly is going to declare war on Austria and Prussia on April 20th, 1792. And this is when the revolution is really going to start to take a change. On August 10th, 1792, Parisian crowds are going to attack the Royal Palace in Paris. They're going to attack the Legislative Assembly. So the new form of government that was just finalized less than a year ago is going to fall. The king and queen are going to be arrested and put in prison. And this is when the second radical revolution would begin. And so the next portion of the French Revolution is considered the Reign of Terror.